There is a particular kind of silence that lives in a Victorian house in winter. It is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of restraint, of everything held carefully in its proper place. Rain moves against the tall windows. Cold smoke drifts from the fireplaces on every floor, rising through the cold air of the stairwell, settling into the curtains, into the wool of a grey dress, into the pages of a book held open in careful ink-stained hands. If you enjoy listening to sleep history stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Somewhere in this house, on an upper floor, in a room that is neither quite a bedroom nor quite a schoolroom, a woman sits very still. She has a straight back and a composed face and a quality of attention that suggests she has trained herself over many years to take up as little space as possible. She's educated. She's accomplished. She speaks French with a good accent and plays the pianoforte with feeling and can name the capitals of every nation in Europe. She's also, by the precise and unforgiving logic of Victorian England, nobody in particular. She was too educated to be a servant, too poor to be a lady. She lived in a house where nobody treated her as either, and if she tried to leave, there was nowhere to go. This is her story. To understand the governess, you must first understand the world that made her. Not the world of novels, though novels will help. The actual world. The world of cold lodging houses and census forms and newspaper advertisements and charity registers. The world of Victorian England in the middle decades of the 19th century, where the rules of class and gender and money were written so precisely and enforced so completely that a woman's entire life could be determined before she was old enough to understand what life was. England in the 1840s and 1850s was a country in the middle of an enormous transformation. The Industrial Revolution had been reshaping it for decades, filling the northern cities with mills and factories and the particular grey light of smoke over brick. London had grown into something almost beyond comprehension, a city of 2 million people in 1850, spreading outward through its new railway lines, its terraces of identical houses, its parks and markets and churches and courts of law. The population of England and Wales had doubled in 50 years. The middle classes, that broad and anxious and endlessly self-improving group, had grown with it. The middle classes. This is where our story begins. Not at the very top of society, among the aristocracy with their inherited estates and their settled income from land. Not at the bottom, among the labouring poor who worked in the factories and fields and had no expectation of refinement. The middle classes occupied the space between, and within that space there were gradations of such precision that a family's exact standing could be read from the height of their ceilings, the quality of their tablecloth, the number of their servants, and the accent in which their daughters spoke. A middle-class family of comfortable means kept a cook, and a housemaid, and perhaps a parlour-maid. They lived in a solid terrace in a respectable part of town. They attended church on Sundays and received calls on Tuesdays, and sent their sons to good schools and their daughters to the pianoforte teacher and the drawing master. They gave dinners and attended dinners. They subscribed to circulating libraries. They were not rich, but they were not anxious, and the distinction mattered enormously to them. But England in the 1840s was also a place of sudden, violent financial collapse. A bad investment, a failed bank, a merchant ship lost at sea, a husband dead of fever at 50, a family business destroyed by a more efficient competitor, a father who had borrowed against an income that evaporated. Any of these could reduce a family of comfortable means to a family of desperate straits within a single year. And when that happened, when the tablecloth was sold and the servants were let go and the tall terrace house was given up for something smaller and meaner, it was the daughters who found themselves in the most impossible position. A son could work. This was understood. A son could enter a profession, take a clerkship, go into trade, join the army, emigrate to the colonies. His options were limited and often hard, but they existed. A daughter could not work, not in any way that a middle-class family could openly acknowledge without social disgrace. She could not go into a factory. She could not go into service, not as a housemaid or a cook or any of the positions that required manual labour, and placed a woman firmly among the working poor. She had been raised to be a lady. The raising itself closed most doors. What she could do, what she had been unwittingly prepared for through all those years of lessons and improvement, was teach. She could teach other people's children. She could go into another family's house and spend her days in the schoolroom, instructing the next generation in the accomplishments she had been given. French conversation and geography and watercolour painting and pianoforte and the careful deportment of a young woman of good family, she could become a governess. This was presented, if it was presented at all, as a respectable solution, a temporary arrangement perhaps, until something better came along, until a suitable marriage presented itself, until the family's circumstances improved. But in truth, for the vast majority of women who became governesses, it was not temporary at all. It was the shape of their entire working life. From the first position, taken in desperation at 20 or 22, to the last dismissal, delivered without ceremony at 40 or 50, with no pension and nowhere particular to go. The census of 1851 counted almost 25,000 women employed as governesses in England and Wales. This is a number worth sitting with for a moment. 25,000 women, each of them in a house that was not her own, teaching children who were not her children, navigating a social position that had no name because Victorian society had not quite decided what to call a woman who was neither servant nor family member nor guest. 25,000 women. And that is only the ones the census counted. It does not include those between positions, or those who had retired into destitution, or those who had slipped beneath the record entirely. How did they come to be there, all these women, in all these houses? The answer lies in the particular trap that Victorian society had built, not from malice exactly, but from the intersection of its most deeply held beliefs about class and gender and the proper order of things. A middle-class girl was educated. This was agreed upon. Education was a sign of gentility, an investment in a daughter's marriageability, a demonstration of the family's standing. She learned French and music and drawing and perhaps a little Italian. She learned to carry herself and to converse and to manage a household. She learned, in other words, to be a lady. But she was not taught anything that could be converted into professional skill. She was not taught to think systematically or to argue, or to understand the law or medicine or commerce. She was not given the tools of any trade. What she received was an ornamental education, beautiful and almost entirely unpractical, that fitted her perfectly for a life of genteel leisure and rather badly for anything else. And then, when that life of genteel leisure did not materialize, when the father died or the money ran out or the expected husband failed to appear, she was left holding an education that had exactly one market value. She could teach what she knew to someone else's children. She could sell, for 20 or 30, or if she was lucky £50 a year, the accomplishments that had been intended to make her attractive to her husband. The smell of a Victorian schoolroom stayed with you. Chalk dust and the particular dry smell of old books and the oil of the lamp that burned even in daylight because the windows faced north. Cold in winter, the small fire barely touching the chill, the globe on the shelf with its painted oceans, the scratched deal table where the lessons were laid out each morning, the sound of a child conjugating French verbs, halting and reluctant, while outside the window the rest of the household went about its day. This was the world she had been given. It was the only world available, and she learned, as all of them learned, to inhabit it with as much quiet dignity as she could manage. The cruelty of the governess's position was not accidental. It was, in a sense, structural. It was built into the very logic of the society that produced her, and it operated through the same values that society held most dear: the importance of education, the necessity of respectability, the rigid division of the world into those above and those below. All of these combined, in the case of the governess, to create something that trapped rather than supported, that marked rather than elevated, that educated a woman for a role in which that education itself became a source of her suffering. Let us begin with the market. If you wished to employ a governess in Victorian England, you went about it in several ways. You might advertise in the newspaper. The Morning Post and the Times both carried columns of advertisements, from ladies seeking situations and families seeking governesses, written in a language of careful understatement that concealed, beneath its proprieties, the raw economics of desperation. A lady of good family, reduced circumstances, excellent references, seeks a situation in a respectable household. Or from the other direction, wanted, a governess for 3 children, must be proficient in French, music, and drawing, references required, salary £30 per annum. £30 per annum. This is worth dwelling on. In the 1850s, a skilled male clerk in a London office might earn £80 or £90 a year. A butler in a large establishment could expect £60 or £70, with his meals and accommodation included. A cook in a good household earned perhaps £30 to £40 with similar board. A governess, a woman who had been educated to a level above any of these, who spoke French and played the pianoforte and had perhaps a smattering of Italian and could discourse on the geography of the known world, earned somewhere between £20 and £100 a year, depending on the family and the position, and most of them earned considerably closer to 20 than to 100. The Victorian Governess Benevolent Institution, which we will return to in more detail, kept careful records of the women who applied to it for assistance. Those records show wages that are almost painful to read. A governess who had served for 20 years, who had educated multiple generations of children in 3 or 4 different households, who had references from families of unimpeachable standing, might find herself at 50 in possession of savings of £40 or £50, not £40 or £50 a year, £40 or £50 total, the accumulated savings of 20 years of careful, frugal living in other people's houses. Why were the wages so low? The answer is simple and brutal: supply. The number of women who needed to work as governesses vastly exceeded the number of positions available. 25,000 women in the 1851 census, competing for the households that could afford to keep a governess at all. When supply exceeds demand so dramatically, the price falls. The employer held all the power. She could name her terms. She could insist on French and music and drawing and Italian and the management of a schoolroom of 4 or 5 children, and she could offer £30 a year and receive 50 applications within a fortnight. This oversupply had another cause beyond the simple mathematics of ruined families. The middle of the 19th century saw a significant demographic imbalance. There were, statistically, more women than men in Victorian England, a consequence of emigration, of the higher death rates among young men in trade and industry, of the wars that had taken men abroad. These surplus women, as the Victorians themselves called them, with their characteristic lack of delicacy, had to do something. And for the educated among them, the governess's position was the only something available. There were registry offices that placed governesses in positions, operating rather like employment agencies, taking a fee from both the governess and the family. The quality of these offices varied enormously. Some were run honestly, matching experienced women with suitable households, and maintaining some standard of reference and recommendation. Others were less scrupulous, placing women in households that had misrepresented their circumstances, or presenting governesses with credentials they had embellished or invented. The governess, arriving in a new house with her trunk and her references and her careful composure, could not always know in advance what she was walking into. References were everything. Without a good reference from a previous employer, a governess could not obtain a new position. This gave the employing family an almost absolute power over the woman who worked for them. A mistress who was dissatisfied for whatever reason, real or imagined, could simply decline to provide a reference, or could provide one that was lukewarm, or could say nothing at all, which in the precise language of Victorian recommendation was understood to mean something unfavourable. The governess had no recourse. She could not argue, could not complain to any authority, could not sue. She could only leave and hope that her next application was judged on its own merits, and when she left one position, she entered a period of particular anxiety. Between positions, a governess was technically homeless. She lived, if she was lucky, with relatives who could take her in. If she had no relatives, or if her relatives could not afford to keep her, she took lodgings, paying from her small savings for a room in a boarding house, while she answered advertisements and attended to the anxious arithmetic of how long her money would last. This liminal state, between positions and between places, was one of the most vulnerable moments in a governess's life, and it repeated itself for many women over and over across the decades of their working years. There is a quality to waiting that Victorian women knew well, the particular stillness of a woman sitting in a small room with a letter to write, and an uncertain future before her. The way time moves differently when you're waiting to hear whether your application has been accepted. The sound of the landlady's footstep on the stair, wondering if it brings a letter or only the bill. The window overlooking a street she does not know, in a city that is not hers, counting the days against her savings and composing, in her careful copper-plate hand, another application in the language of respectful understatement that the conventions of the time required. She wrote, "I have the honour to apply for the situation of a governess advertised in this morning's paper. I am the daughter of a clergyman of good standing in the county of and have been educated in all the usual accomplishments. I am prepared to instruct in French, music, drawing, geography, and the elements of arithmetic. I have the very highest references from my previous employers, whose children I had the honour to teach for a period of 3 years. I trust that my qualifications may prove satisfactory and await the honour of your reply." She sealed the letter and sent it out into the world, and then she waited. The schoolroom was always on the upper floors. This was almost universal in the Victorian household of any size, a matter of both convention and logic. The children needed to be contained, their noise and their lessons and their occasional tantrums safely removed from the adult social spaces of the house below. The governess needed to be near her charges, and so the schoolroom occupied the top of the house, along with the nursery and the night nursery and the governess's own small bedroom, up the stairs past the family rooms, up past the servants' attic rooms if the house was large enough to have them, to a floor that existed in a kind of suspended classification, belonging fully to neither the family's world nor the servants'. Come up those stairs slowly in the early morning. The carpet on the main staircase gives way to bare wood on the upper flight. The air is cooler here, slightly stale in winter when the windows are kept shut against the cold. There's a smell of chalk and old paper, and faintly, of the oil lamp that burns on the table in the corner. The governess is already at her desk when the children arrive. She's been up since 7, perhaps earlier, setting out the day's work, reviewing the lesson plans, writing out the exercises in her clear, careful hand. She does not have the luxury of a slow morning. The children come in varying degrees of willingness. In a good household with children who have been raised to treat their governess with respect, they arrive tidily dressed and reasonably attentive. In a less fortunate household, they arrive late and dishevelled and full of resistance, knowing, as all children instinctively know when an adult has no real authority, that the governess cannot actually compel them to do anything. She cannot punish them in any meaningful way. She cannot tell them off to their parents without risking being seen as unable to manage her charges. She can only coax and reason, and maintain, with as much patience as she can summon, the fiction that learning French verbs is a worthwhile occupation for a Tuesday morning. Anne Brontë knew this. She had been a governess herself at 2 different households, and her novel Agnes Grey, published in 1847, is the most precise and least romantic account of the governess's daily experience that the period produced. Where her sister Charlotte transformed the governess into a heroine of unusual moral force, Anne simply reported. The children in Agnes Grey are spoiled, cruel, and completely ungovernable. Their parents are indifferent to their education and inclined to take the children's side in any dispute. Agnes herself is exhausted and lonely and often close to despair, though she does not permit herself the luxury of showing it. The novel is uncomfortable reading precisely because it is so clearly true. A typical day in the schoolroom began with reading, then moved through arithmetic and geography and whatever languages the governess was employed to teach. French was almost universal. A smattering of Italian was considered elegant. German was occasionally required in households with connections to the continent. The morning was for lessons proper, the afternoon for what the Victorians called accomplishments, music, drawing, needlework, the particular ornamental skills that marked a girl as a girl of good family. Walks were taken in the afternoon, weather permitting, the governess walking slightly behind the children at a pace suited to the youngest, carrying the umbrella and the bag and keeping a careful eye on the road. She ate her meals with the children, or sometimes alone, or in households that observed the convention most strictly, at the end of the family table in a silence that everyone carefully maintained. Her food was the same food the family ate, a distinction that separated her from the servants who ate in the kitchen, but the context in which she ate it was so charged with ambiguity that the food itself brought little comfort. She was always at the dinner table a problem of social arithmetic that the household had not quite solved. The children she taught were her primary company during the working day. This was both a solace and a complication. A governess who loved children, and many of them did, could find genuine satisfaction in watching a child begin to read, or solve a sum, or play a piece of music through correctly for the first time. She could feel, on good days, that her work had meaning, that she was forming minds and characters that would carry something of her careful teaching into the world. She could become genuinely fond of her charges, and they of her. But the children were not hers. This was the central grief of the schoolroom, quiet but persistent. When the children were ill, it was the mother who sat with them. When they achieved something remarkable, it was the mother who received the credit. When the children grew old enough to leave the schoolroom, it was the family that celebrated their passage into the adult world. The governess, who had spent years forming those children, watched them graduate out of her care and into a world where her contribution was not acknowledged and her attachment had no name. She was thanked, perhaps. She was given a reference. She moved on to the next household, carrying with her the accumulated weight of children she had loved and let go. There is a particular sound that empty schoolrooms have. The silence after the children have gone to their lessons or their walk or their tea. The scratch of the governess's pen as she marks exercises or writes letters home. The occasional creak of the house settling around her. The distant sound of the kitchen far below. She has the room to herself for an hour, perhaps, and she sits at the deal table and works, and the afternoon light moves across the scratched surface of the desk, and the globe turns slightly on its axis in a draught from the door, and the painted oceans catch the light and then lose it again. She was good at what she did. Most of them were. The children of Victorian England's middle and upper classes were taught, for the most part, by women of intelligence and application, who had been given exactly enough education to make them useful, but not quite enough to make them independent. It was a careful calibration, though no one had planned it as such. It was simply the result of 1,000 individual decisions made by a society that had not yet decided what educated women were actually for. There is a scene that appears, in some variation, in almost every account of the Victorian governess. She's sitting in the drawing room, or attempting to sit in the drawing room, on an evening when the family's at home and visitors have come to call. She's there because she's neither quite a servant, who would not be admitted to the drawing room at all, nor quite a guest, who would be welcomed and introduced. She sits in an intermediate position, near the window perhaps, with a piece of needlework or a book, present but peripheral, spoken to occasionally and not spoken to for long stretches, neither included nor excluded, but occupying that peculiar social limbo that was the governess's permanent condition. The Victorian household was a highly organised social system, and every person within it had a defined place. At the top were the family, the master and mistress of the house, their children, their relatives and guests. In the middle, running the material operations of the household, were the upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the cook. Below them were the underservants, the footmen, the housemaids, the kitchen maids, the scullery maid. Everyone knew where they stood. Everyone had their dining arrangements and their forms of address, and their precise responsibilities, and their precise limitations. The governess did not fit into this system. She was not family. She was addressed as Miss rather than by her given name, which marked her above the servants. She did not eat in the kitchen, which separated her from them physically. She was expected to dress in a manner that reflected the family's respectability, which required expenditure that her salary barely supported. She was permitted to use the drawing room, and sometimes the library. She might be included in family prayers and family walks and family meals in a way that a housemaid never would be, but she was also paid. This single fact placed a wall between her and the family she lived among. She was an employee. Her presence in the household was a commercial arrangement, not a social one. She could be dismissed. Her opinion on household matters was not sought. Her personal life was not a subject for conversation. She was there to perform a service, and the service was all. The servants, for their part, often resented her. She was above them in form, but not in substance. She did not manage them, as the housekeeper did. She had no authority over them and could not give them orders. But she ate differently and dressed differently and was addressed differently, and this distinction, maintained by the family's conventions even when it conferred no real advantage on the governess, was felt by the servants as a slight. She was playing at being a lady in a house where everyone knew she was not one. The servants knew better than anyone how the household really worked, and they knew exactly what the governess was worth. There were households where all this was managed with kindness. Families who recognised the awkwardness of the position and made genuine efforts to include the governess in the social life of the house, to treat her with the consideration owed to any educated person living under their roof. There were mistresses who consulted the governess on the children's progress, who invited her to join the family at dinner, who remembered her birthday and gave her small gifts at Christmas. These households existed, and the women who were fortunate enough to find themselves in them remembered the kindness for the rest of their lives. But they were not the norm. The norm was something more like indifference, shot through with occasional condescension. The governess was background furniture, noticed when needed and otherwise looked through. The family occupied the foreground of its own life, as families naturally do, and the governess was part of the setting rather than the story. She was there when the children needed their lessons. She was not there when the family needed her not to be there. The mistress of the house occupied a particularly complex relationship with her children's governess. On one level, the governess was her employee, hired to do a job that the mistress herself could not or preferred not to do, and that relationship was simple enough. But on another level, the governess lived in the house. She was with the children for more hours of the day than the mother was. She knew which child had a reading difficulty, and which was frightened of the dark, and which had been crying last Tuesday after a sharp word at dinner. She held an intimate knowledge of the family's private life that the family had not quite bargained on when they hired her. For some mistresses, this proximity became a source of anxiety. A young governess, educated and accomplished, and with a quality of attention that years in the schoolroom had sharpened, was a presence in the household that required managing. The master of the house noticed her, if only because she was there, at the breakfast table and the evening meal and the occasional drawing-room gathering. The sons of the house growing up noticed her. The social novels of the period are full of this particular danger, the educated poor woman in the household who might capture a heart she had no right to. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre made the danger romantic. In practice, it made the governess an object of suspicion in households where suspicion came easily. What the governess felt about all this she mostly did not say. The letters that survive from Victorian governesses are careful documents, restrained in their complaints, generous in their descriptions of the children, cautious about anything that might be read by someone other than the intended recipient. She had learned discretion as thoroughly as she had learned French. Her inner life, the loneliness and the resentment and the occasional flash of anger, and the ongoing effort of maintaining a dignified composure in a position that offered little dignity, was largely invisible to the household that depended on her quiet endurance. She sat in the drawing-room with her needlework, and she looked out at the rain, and she listened to the family conversation around her, and she said little, and felt much, and carried it all upstairs with her at the end of the evening to the small room that was her only truly private space, where she could set down the careful performance of contentment and simply exist for a few hours as herself. The arithmetic of a Victorian governess's life was unforgiving. It worked against her with the patient, impersonal efficiency of compound interest running backwards, accumulating not wealth, but vulnerability, not security but exposure, year by year, until she arrived at 50 or 55 or 60 with a small sum of savings, no home, no pension, and a market that had long since ceased to be interested in her. Begin with the wages. £20 to £100 a year was the official range, but the distribution within that range was deeply skewed. The lower end was occupied by the majority. A first position, taken by a young woman with good references but no experience, might pay £20 to £25 a year. This was not nothing, but it was not much. From this sum she was expected to dress respectably, which meant wool dresses and a decent bonnet and the small items of clothing and personal care that a woman in a visible social position required. She was expected to contribute to the cost of any stamps or stationery she used for personal correspondence. She might be expected to pay for her own travel between positions, or for the cost of any professional examination she sat. What remained after these deductions was saved, not spent, saved carefully against the day of need that she knew was coming because it always came. A governess between positions was a governess without income. A governess who fell ill was, in most cases, a governess without income, because few families continued to pay wages to an employee who could not work. A governess who was dismissed for whatever reason lost her income immediately. Against all of these possibilities she saved. Dismissal was perhaps the most common anxiety. It came in many forms. The children grew older, and the schoolroom was no longer needed. The family moved abroad and could not, or did not, take the governess with them. The family's financial circumstances deteriorated, and the governess was an expense they could no longer justify. The mistress of the house took a dislike to the governess, for reasons never precisely articulated, and decided that a change was required. The master of the house behaved in ways that made the governess's position untenable, and since she could not complain without destroying her own reputation, she left. When dismissal came, it came quickly. A governess might be given a week's notice, or a month's notice, or in some cases simply told that her services were no longer required and that she should arrange to leave as soon as possible. The reference was written, or not written, in the mistress's own time, in terms that reflected the mistress's own feelings about the parting. The governess packed her trunk, which contained everything she owned in the world, and she left the house that had been her home for months or years, and she went back to the business of finding another situation. If she was young and healthy and her references were good, this was manageable. Difficult and anxious and expensive, but manageable. If she was older, it was something else entirely. The governess market had very little use for women over 40. Families wanted young women for their schoolrooms, energetic, adaptable, able to take long walks with the children and maintain the kind of patient enthusiasm that sustained days of French verbs and watercolour exercises. A woman of 50, however experienced and skilled, was considered past her usefulness as a governess. She might find work as a companion, a rather vague position that required her to be agreeable and available without the dignity of the schoolroom title. She might find work as a reader to an elderly lady, or as a housekeeper in an establishment that required someone of education to manage it. More often she found nothing. The Governess's Benevolent Institution was founded in 1843, and the fact of its founding is itself a kind of indictment of the society that made it necessary. It was established by a group of philanthropically minded people who had looked at the situation of destitute governesses, women who had spent their working lives in other people's houses and arrived at old age with nothing, and decided that something should be done. The institution provided temporary accommodation for governesses between positions, annuities for retired governesses who had no other income, and a register of respectable situations for women seeking employment. The numbers who applied were larger than even the founders had anticipated. In its first year, the institution was overwhelmed. Applications came from women who had been governesses for 10, 15, 20 years. Women with excellent references from families of good standing. Women who had educated the daughters of lords and the sons of bankers and the children of clergymen throughout the south of England, and who now lived in a single rented room and wrote their applications in the same careful copper-plate hand they had used to correct their pupils' exercises, asking for £20 or £30 a year, an annuity that would allow them to keep a roof over their head and food in front of them until they died. The records make painful reading. A woman of 63, a governess for 37 years, applying for an annuity of £18 per year. A woman of 58 who had served in 8 different households over 22 years and had saved £42, which would last, at current lodging costs, perhaps 18 months. A woman of 45 who had been dismissed without reference, when her employer discovered that she had been corresponding with a man, a distant cousin, to whom she had once been briefly engaged, and who now could not obtain a new position because she had no recent reference, and could not explain the gap in her employment history without ruining herself entirely. These were not exceptional cases. They were ordinary ones. They were what happened when a society decided that educated women's labour was worth £30 a year, and then provided no mechanism for those women to build any security from it. They were what happened when the only safety net available to a class of 25,000 women was a small charity that could provide annuities to a few hundred of them. They were what happened, in other words, when the arithmetic of a life was set up from the beginning to produce this outcome. She had known, most of them, that this was likely. They were not naive. They read the newspapers and they saw the advertisements and they knew the stories of the women before them. They saved carefully and they planned carefully and they maintained, for as long as they could, the dignity and the competence that were their only real assets. And then, in the end, the arithmetic came for them as it came for everyone, and they sat in a small room somewhere and wrote their careful letters to the institution, and they waited. In the autumn of 1847, 2 novels were published within months of each other that would change the way Victorian England thought about governesses. The first was Agnes Grey by Acton Bell. The second was Jane Eyre by Currer Bell. Both names were pseudonyms, both authors were women, both had been governesses. Anne Bronte, the youngest of the Bronte sisters, had worked as a governess at 2 different households, the Ingham family at Blake Hall and the Robinson family at Thorpe Green, between 1839 and 1845. Agnes Grey was written from this experience, and the closeness of the connection gives it a particular quality that distinguishes it from every other governess novel of the period. It is not romantic, it is not dramatic, it is simply true, with the quiet, devastating truthfulness of a woman who has lived something and written it down without embellishment. Agnes Grey arrives at her first position full of energy and determination, having persuaded her reluctant family to allow her to seek employment as a governess to help with the household finances. The Murrays she encounters are nothing like what she anticipated. The children are willful, spoiled, and entirely without interest in anything she's attempting to teach them. The parents are indifferent to the children's education and quick to take their side against the governess in any conflict. Agnes is lonely, exhausted, and often close to tears, but she does not permit herself the luxury of showing any of this. She maintains her composure with the tenacity of someone who knows that losing it would cost her everything. The novel is quiet in its anger. Anne Bronte does not rage against the system. She simply describes it in such patient and accurate detail that the description itself becomes the argument. You do not need to be told that the treatment Agnes receives is unjust. You see it. You feel it in the accumulation of small humiliations, the children's cruelty, the mistress's dismissiveness, the isolation of the upper floor, the silence at the dinner table. You understand by the end of the novel exactly how this system worked and exactly what it cost the women who were caught in it. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre operates at a different register entirely. Charlotte had also been a governess at the Sidgwick family at Stone Gap Hall in Yorkshire in 1839, an experience she found deeply uncongenial and from which she returned after only 2 months. She brought to her novel not Anne's patient documentary realism, but something fiercer, a moral vision, a determination to insist on the full humanity of the governess against a society that preferred to treat her as furniture. Jane Eyre is a governess who refuses to be diminished. When Rochester, the master of Thornfield Hall, treats her as a lesser being, she corrects him, quietly but unmistakably. When society suggests that her poverty and her position make her inferior to those around her, she insists on the equality of souls. Her famous declaration that she is no automaton, that she is no machine, that she has a mind and feelings of her own, is one of the most direct challenges to the Victorian social order that the literature of the period contains, and it was written by a woman who had sat in the schoolroom of a Yorkshire family and felt exactly that erasure. Both novels appeared in the same year as William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, which contained in Becky Sharp another governess, though one who declined to be a victim and chose instead to be a schemer. Becky Sharp is not a sympathetic portrait. She's brilliant and opportunistic and utterly without scruple, a woman who uses her education and her wits to climb a social ladder that was designed to prevent her from doing so by any means available. She is, in other words, what the governess was feared to be if she refused to accept her quiet subordination. These 3 novels, appearing within months of each other in 1847, represent something important. They represent the moment at which the governess question, as the Victorians called it, entered the literary mainstream. The governess was not simply a social phenomenon. She was a literary figure, a symbol through whom society examined its contradictions, its hypocrisies, its uncomfortable questions about women and education and class and money. The fact that she appeared so repeatedly in Victorian fiction, in so many different forms, suggests that she troubled the culture deeply. She was too present to ignore and too complicated to resolve. There were other women who wrote about the governess from the inside. Mary Wollstonecraft, who had been a governess before she became a philosopher, and the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, had written about the position with the disgust of a woman who experienced it as a kind of imprisonment. George Eliot, who never worked as a governess but who moved in the same intellectual circles as the women who were changing women's education in England, addressed the theme of women's wasted intellectual potential repeatedly throughout her fiction. The women who wrote back, in other words, were doing something important. They were making the governess visible. They were insisting that she had an interior life, a perspective, a moral seriousness that the society around her tended to deny. They were arguing through the medium of fiction that the system that produced her was unjust and that its injustice had consequences, for the women who endured it and for the society that depended on their quiet endurance. The books were read. That was the remarkable thing. Jane Eyre was an immediate sensation, reprinted 3 times in its first year. Agnes Grey sold more quietly but steadily. Vanity Fair was the literary event of 1847. The reading public encountered the governess in her fiction as a figure of genuine complexity, and something shifted slowly in the way Victorian society thought about her, not quickly, not decisively, But the books had been written, and they could not be unwritten, and the questions they asked did not go away. In the summer of 1848, a college opened in Harley Street in London. It was called Queen's College, and it offered, for the first time in England, a programme of genuine academic instruction to women over the age of 12. The professors who taught there were men from King's College, London, and they taught subjects that women had never before been formally examined in: mathematics, English literature, Latin, history, natural philosophy. The college offered certificates of qualification, a piece of paper that said, in effect, this woman has been taught this subject to this standard. She is competent, she can be trusted. The founding of Queen's College was not accidental. It grew directly from the governess question. The men behind it, principally the theologian and novelist F.D. Maurice, had looked at the situation of the 25,000 women working as governesses in England and asked a simple question: why were they so poorly paid? The answer, Maurice argued, was partly a matter of supply, but also substantially a matter of qualification. Governesses had no professional credentials. Any woman who claimed to be able to teach French or music or drawing could call herself a governess and seek employment. There was no way for a family to verify what a governess actually knew or how well she could teach it. The title was meaningless as a professional category. If governesses had genuine qualifications, Maurice reasoned, their situation might improve. Families would pay more for a governess who could demonstrate actual competence. The market would differentiate between the qualified and the unqualified. Women with real academic credentials would command real academic wages. It was an optimistic theory, and it was only partly right. But it produced an institution that was to become one of the most important in the history of women's education in England. Queen's College offered its first courses in 1848, and within a year had several hundred students. The curriculum was genuinely rigorous by the standards of the time, and the college attracted women of serious intellectual ambition. Among its early students were Dorothea Beale and Frances Buss, who would go on to found the Cheltenham Ladies' College and the North London Collegiate School for Girls respectively, and who would reshape the landscape of women's secondary education in England over the following decades. The Governess's Benevolent Institution, founded 5 years earlier in 1843, had approached the same problem from a different direction. Where Queen's College was attempting to improve the governess's position through education, the institution was attempting to manage the consequences of a system that had already failed the women it was supposed to support. It operated primarily as a relief charity, providing accommodation for governesses between positions at a residential home in Harley Street, assisting governesses who were ill or destitute, and paying annuities to retired governesses who had no other income. The demand for its services was, from the beginning, larger than its resources could meet. In its first year of operation, the institution received applications from 330 women for the 12 annuities it could afford to pay. 330 women, each of them with a story, each of them with a life of service behind them, and a future of poverty before them, competing for 12 annual payments of between £20 and £25. The committee that made the selections described their task as one of the most painful they had ever undertaken. The institution continued to grow and to struggle through the 1850s and 1860s. It built a larger home. It increased the number of annuities it could pay. It established a register of qualified governesses that was intended to bring some order to the chaotic market for their services. It did what it could, and what it could do was not nothing, but it was a charity attempting to address a structural problem, and structural problems are not solved by charity. The structural problem, as the first generation of women's education reformers began to understand, was not primarily about the governess at all. It was about women's education in general. As long as women were denied access to universities, to professional qualifications, to the full range of intellectual and vocational training available to men, the pool of educated but unqualified women would continue to overflow the limited number of positions available to them. The governess was a symptom of a much larger condition, and treating the symptom would only do so much. The arguments being made in the 1860s, as the women's education movement gathered force, were arguments about access. Women should be admitted to university examinations. Women should be able to study medicine and law and the other learned professions. Women who wish to teach should be trained as teachers, with proper pedagogical preparation, not simply hired on the basis of their own inadequate schooling. These arguments met with substantial resistance, but they also met gradually with some success. Girton College, the the first residential college for women at Cambridge, was founded in 1869. Newnham followed in 1871. Bedford College in London had been admitting women since 1849. The medical schools were beginning against fierce opposition to allow women to qualify as doctors. The world was not changing quickly, but it was changing, and the change was being driven in significant part by the recognition that the current system was producing, in its surplus of educated but unqualified women, an enormous waste of human capacity that the society could not afford. The governess herself was often too busy surviving to participate directly in these arguments. She was in the schoolroom marking exercises, she was writing applications in lodging houses, she was sitting in the interview room at the registry office, trying to present her qualifications in the best possible light. But the arguments were made on her behalf, and they were made more loudly as the decades passed, and slowly, the world in which she had been trapped began to change around her. Let the day slow now. Let it release its grip. The children are in bed. You can hear their breathing through the thin wall between the schoolroom and the night nursery, that particular deep and unguarded breathing of children who have given themselves over entirely to sleep, careless of everything, trusting the world to hold still until morning. The schoolroom is quiet. The lamp on the table burns with a small, steady flame, and the circle of light it makes is warm against the darkness outside the window. She's still at the table, not working now. The exercises have been marked, the lesson plans for tomorrow set out in their order, the ink dried in its pot. She's writing a letter slowly, choosing each word with care. To her mother, perhaps, to a sister, to the friend from her girlhood who is now married and living somewhere in the countryside and whose letters arrive, occasionally full of the small news of a domestic life that has taken a different shape from this one. She does not write everything. She never does. The loneliness she does not describe in quite those terms. The particular quality of an evening in the upper rooms of another family's house, when the sounds of that family's life drift up from below, laughter and the clatter of silver and the piano being played, a piece she knows, she could play it herself, and she sits in the schoolroom with the sounds of a social world she is not part of floating up through the floors like a kind of ghost. She does not describe this precisely. She writes that the children are progressing well, and that the weather has been cold this week, and that she has been reading, when she has the time, a novel that a previous pupil sent to her. She writes that she is well. She is always, in letters, well. The house is settling into the sounds of night. Houses have their own voices in the quiet, the creak of timber cooling, the movement of wind through the gaps around the windows, the distant shifting of coals in the kitchen range where the cook banks the fire each evening before she goes to bed. There is something almost companionable about these sounds when you know them well enough. She has been in this house for 2 years, long enough to know its particular vocabulary of creaks and settlings, long enough that its sounds in the night are familiar rather than alarming. She folds the letter and sets it aside to post in the morning. She does not move immediately. She sits with her hands quiet in her lap and the lamp burning and the silence of the house around her, and she allows herself for a few minutes simply to be still. This is harder than it sounds. The work of being a governess required a constant management of self, a performance of patience and composure that was genuinely exhausting, not because the work itself was physically demanding, but because it required, every waking hour, a careful regulation of expression and voice and response. The exhaustion was the kind that came from never being entirely off duty, never quite being free to be simply a person rather than a position. The candle on the window ledge has burned low. Through the glass she can see the winter sky, very clear tonight after the rain of the afternoon, the stars bright and numerous above the rooftops. London never achieved true darkness, even in the 1850s. There was always the glow of gas lamps from the streets below, the light from other windows, the accumulated brightness of a city that did not entirely sleep. But up here, on the upper floor, with the night quiet around her, she could almost believe she was somewhere else. A house in the country, perhaps. Her parents' house, a place that had once been unambiguously hers. She thinks about the morning. First lesson at 9, French with the older children, then geography with all 3. The eldest was making real progress with her reading French, showing a genuine feeling for the sounds of the language that made teaching it a pleasure. The middle child was still struggling with the irregular verbs, but she was trying, and trying was what mattered at this stage. The youngest was not quite ready for proper lessons yet, still in the stage of games and pictures and the first letters of the alphabet, but there was something attentive in her face when she listened that suggested a careful intelligence waiting to develop. She noticed these things. This was her work, to notice the particular quality of each child's mind and meet it where it was, not where she wished it to be. It was careful, attentive work, and she was good at it. She knew she was good at it, and that knowledge was one of the few unmixed satisfactions her position offered. The children she taught would carry something of her attention forward into their own lives. Not her name, probably, not her story, but some quality of mind, some habit of care in their thinking, some approach to a problem or a text or a piece of music that she had shaped in those long schoolroom hours. She would be invisible in them, as she was invisible here, but she would be present. The lamp is guttering. She does not trim it. She sits in the dimming light and lets the day release her, slowly, the way a held breath releases without force simply because it has been held long enough. The children breathe in the next room. The house makes its small sounds. The stars are still, there above the rooftops, unchanged by anything that has happened today in this particular household in this particular year. She closes her eyes. The letter is folded. The lessons are prepared. The fire has burned to embers in the grate, and the room is growing slowly, gently cool, the kind of cool that you feel first at the skin and then deeper, the kind that invites you to pull the covers up and let the mind go quiet. The children are sleeping. The house is sleeping. The street below is nearly silent now, only the occasional sound of a late carriage, the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the neighbourhood, sounds that pass through the night air without disturbing it. She's very still. The chair, the table, the lamp with its dying flame, the window with its dark glass. She is very still, and the stillness is neither unhappy nor happy, but simply present. The way rest is present, the way the body finally stops its effort and accepts the dark. By the 1880s, the world had changed, not completely, not irreversibly, but in the small, significant ways that matter more over time than the large, dramatic ones. The schoolrooms of England still existed. Governesses still worked in them, still ate their meals at the end of the family table, still occupied the ambiguous space between the family and the servants, still managed on wages that would have seemed inadequate even if they had been fairly offered. But something else was also true. The world that had made the governess was being slowly, carefully taken apart. The women's colleges at Cambridge had been joined by others. The University of London was awarding degrees to women. The medical schools, after decades of fierce resistance, had admitted women who were now practicing as physicians. The teaching profession, not private instruction in schoolrooms but formal teaching in the new board schools and the expanding girls' secondary schools, was opening to women with proper qualifications and offering salaries and conditions that the governess had never known. The typewriter had appeared in the offices of London, creating a new category of respectable female employment. The shop girl, the bank clerk, the teacher in a proper school with a salary and colleagues and a professional identity. These were becoming possible as the governess faded. She did not vanish immediately. Governess positions continued to be advertised and filled well into the 20th century. In the households of the very rich, the private governess persisted as a status symbol and a convenience long after most families had sent their daughters to schools. But the great mass of educated women who had once had no choice but the schoolroom began to find other paths, and as they did, the peculiar social problem of the governess, which had troubled the Victorian mind so persistently for 5 decades, began to dissolve. What did she leave behind? This is the question worth asking now, in the quiet of the evening, as the story draws toward its end. She left behind, first and most literally, the children she had taught. They were not hers, as we have said, and they were not always grateful, and they often could not have named her in later life without pausing to think. But they carried her. They carried the French she had drilled into them on winter mornings, the geography she had made vivid through coloured maps and careful description, the music she had taught them with her hands over theirs at the keyboard. They carried the habit of care she had modelled in the schoolroom, the patience with difficulty, the willingness to return to the same problem again and again until it yielded. These things she had given them, and they persisted long after her name had been forgotten. She left behind also the argument her existence made. The governess question had forced Victorian society to confront for the first time the situation of educated women who needed to work. It had made that situation visible, through the census numbers and the charitable registers and the novels and the newspaper debates. in a way that could not easily be ignored. The reformers who built the women's colleges and pushed for women's admission to the professions drew repeatedly on the image of the governess, the woman who had been educated for leisure and condemned to labour, as their central argument for change. She was the evidence. She was the proof that the current system did not work, that it wasted human capacity on a massive scale, that the solution to the problem of educated women was not charity but access. This argument eventually won. Not quickly, not cleanly, not without enormous resistance from people who believed that the right order of things required women's exclusion from public life. But it won. The universities opened slowly. The professions opened slowly. The vote came in 1918 and 1928. The world the governess had been born into, the world of rigid classification and enforced dependency, was dismantled over the course of the century that followed her. She was part of that dismantling, though she rarely knew it. The women who had been governesses, or who had watched their mothers and aunts be governesses, were among the most motivated advocates for the changes that came. They had seen, in the most personal terms, what the old system cost. They had felt it in their own lives, in the cold schoolrooms and the uncertain wages and the careful letters home that said only that they were well. They had learned, from the very experience that had constrained them, the precise nature of the constraint. And that knowledge, held in the body, was a kind of fuel. Think of her now at the very end of the story. She is still in the schoolroom because the schoolroom was where most of her life was spent. The children are at their lessons. The globe turns slowly on its axis. The afternoon light moves across the scratched deal table. She's watching the eldest child puzzle through a passage of French, watching her lips move slightly as she works out the sounds, watching the slow progress of comprehension across a young face. And she feels, in this ordinary moment, the particular satisfaction of having done something real. She has given this child something, not everything. Not a transformed life or a dramatic education or a blazing intellectual awakening. Something quieter, a habit of attention, a bit of French, the beginnings of a skill. It was enough. It had to be enough. It was what she had to give. Come back now to the beginning. The Victorian house in winter, the rain on the tall windows, the coal smoke rising in the cold air of the stairwell. She is there, still, in the upper room. The children are asleep. The house is quiet. The lamp on the table has burned almost to nothing, the flame small and wavering, casting a very gentle light across the closed book on the table, the folded letter, the few objects that mark this room as hers, or rather, as the room she inhabits for now, until the next position, the next house, the next family's upper floor. She's not entirely unhappy. Unhappiness was too simple a thing for what she felt, too loud. What she felt was quieter and more complex, and had been lived with for so long that it had become simply the texture of things, the way the cold was the texture of winter, or the sound of rain was the texture of an English afternoon. She had made her peace with it, or something close enough to peace to be workable, and that was the most that could honestly be said. The candle on the window ledge goes out, not dramatically, simply. It burns down, and then it is done. The room is darker now, the only light the faint glow from the street far below, the distant brightness of London refusing as always to achieve true dark. She closes her eyes. The house is very still. The children breathe in the next room. Whatever she could not keep, she kept this. The quiet of the upper floor, the sleeping children, the stars, if there are stars tonight, above the rooftops of a city that did not know her name and would not remember it. The long, patient hours of work, adding up to something she could not quite measure but knew was real. The day she had given, fully and without reservation, to other people's children. The French verbs and the geography and the morning walks and the careful lessons and the patience, always the patience, practiced until it became something like wisdom. Let it all go quiet now. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The fire is ash. The room is still. Somewhere in the city, a clock strikes the late hour and the sound dissolves into silence. Sleep well. There is a version of the Victorian governess that history has preserved with some care. The patient woman in the grey dress. The quiet presence on the upper floor. The careful copperplate hand and the composed face and the French verbs and the watercolour exercises. This version is real. It is documented in census records and charitable registers and the letters that survive in family archives, written in the language of restraint that the times required. But there is another version, harder to find, less carefully preserved, but there if you know where to look. It lives in the margins of household accounts, in the private diaries that were not intended for other eyes, in the letters that were kept hidden rather than displayed, in the records of institutions that dealt not with the governess's poverty, but with her resistance. It is the version that Victorian society did not particularly want to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have complicated the image it preferred. The governess as patient sufferer, grateful for her position, content to occupy her ambiguous place without complaint. The truth is that many governesses were not content. They were angry, quietly and persistently angry, and they found ways to express and manage that anger that the history books have largely passed over. Some of them read. Not the improving literature that their employers might have approved, but the dangerous kind. The Political Economy of John Stuart Mill, whose essay on the subjection of women, published in 1869, argued with dry and devastating logic that the subjection of women was not natural or inevitable, but constructed and therefore changeable. The early feminist periodicals that circulated in the 1860s and 70s, arguing for women's suffrage and professional equality, with a directness that would have horrified most of the households where the governess worked. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a book nearly 70 years old by the 1860s but still circulating, still being read, still providing the vocabulary for a kind of anger that had no other official language. She read these books in her room at night after the children were asleep. She read them with the particular intensity of someone who recognizes her own situation described and named, who feels the peculiar relief of finding that the thing she'd thought was only her own private suffering was in fact a structural condition, produced by a system that could be challenged and changed. She underlined passages, occasionally in pencil, the careful marks of a woman thinking hard. She wrote in the margins, she wrote in her diary, the private one that she kept separate from the account book that was officially hers, the one that contained thoughts she would not have expressed aloud in the households where she worked. Some governesses corresponded with each other. This network of women writing across the distance of their separate employments, sharing observations and encouragements, and the small, fierce satisfactions of having noticed something true, was not organised in any formal sense. It was simply women writing letters to other women who understood their situation, creating through correspondence a community that their physical isolation denied them. These letters are difficult to trace now, dispersed across archives and family collections and the general entropy of the past, but enough survive to give a sense of their character. They are sharper than the letters written to employers. They are more honest about the loneliness and the frustration, and the occasional flash of something close to fury. They name things directly that the official correspondence carefully avoided. Some governesses organised, in the limited ways available to them. They attended the lectures at Queen's College when they could, sitting in the back rows of rooms where men were teaching women things that women had been told they could not learn, and feeling in that attendance something they were not always able to name but that functioned as solidarity. They joined the early associations for women's education and women's employment that were forming in London in the 1860s and 70s. They contributed, when they had anything to contribute, to the funds that supported women's causes. They were not passive. They were constrained, deeply constrained, but within those constraints they found ways to push. There was another kind of double life, less elevated, more personal, that the historical record occasionally allows us to glimpse. Love. Not the romantic governess narrative of Jane Eyre, though that narrative had its roots in something real. Simply love, or its possibilities, navigated in circumstances that made it almost impossible. A governess was a young woman, often, living in a household with men. Sons of the house, guests, the master himself in households where the marriage was unhappy, or where the master was simply that kind of man. The conduct guides of the period were full of warnings about this situation. The governess was advised to maintain a careful distance, to discourage any attention that went beyond the professional, to remove herself from situations that might compromise her reputation. Her reputation was her only real currency. A governess with a damaged reputation could not obtain references, and could not obtain positions and therefore could not survive in any material sense. The threat of social disgrace was the most effective mechanism of control available to the Victorian social order, and it was deployed, consciously or not, to keep women who had no other power exactly where they were. She knew this, they all knew this, and so the careful distance was maintained most of the time, and the attention was discouraged most of the time, and the story that was not to be told was not told, except when it was. Buried in the records of the governess's benevolent institution, in the applications of women who had fallen out of regular employment and could not explain why, are the stories that the official history preferred not to examine. Women who had formed attachments in the households where they worked. Women who had been the victims of the very men whose children they taught. Women who had loved, unwisely or otherwise, and paid the full and disproportionate price that Victorian society extracted from women who did not manage their hearts in accordance with the rules. Their applications are phrased in the careful understatement of the time, but the circumstances are legible between the lines if you read them with attention. She had a self underneath the composure, a rich, complicated, privately inhabited self that the role of governess worked hard to suppress but could never entirely eliminate. She had opinions about politics and religion, and the proper education of children and the right ordering of society that she was not permitted to express in the drawing rooms of the houses where she worked. She had desires and ambitions and frustrations and occasional moments of genuine joy that the grey dress and the careful posture were designed to conceal. She was, beneath the performance of the governess, a person. Victorian society found this inconvenient, and so it looked away, and we have been looking away ever since. Not entirely. The novels looked back. Anne Bronte looked back. Charlotte Bronte looked back with something fiercer than looking. The diaries that survive look back. And if you go to the archives and sit with the original documents, the actual letters and account books and charitable registers written in actual hands that held actual pens in actual cold rooms, you find her there, underneath the official version, still present, still distinct, still more than the role she was given. She had a whole life, even in those constrained circumstances. She had it secretly, carefully, in the hours the household did not own. And that secret wholeness, that refusal to be entirely defined by the position she occupied, is perhaps the most important thing about her. She was not only a governess, she was a person who happened to be working as a governess, and the distinction, small as it sounds, was everything. Here is the story that Victorian society really did not want to tell. Some of them broke, not dramatically, not always, sometimes quietly, in ways that were difficult to see from outside the room where it happened. But the pressure of the position, the accumulated weight of years of isolation and constraint and financial precarity, and social invisibility, was not without cost, and the cost was sometimes paid in the currency of mental health. The Victorian period had its own vocabulary for what we would now call mental illness, and it deployed that vocabulary with the same precision and the same cruelty that it deployed all its other classifications. Women who showed signs of what would now be recognised as depression or anxiety, or the kind of acute psychological distress that follows prolonged isolation, were described as nervous, or as suffering from hysteria, or as having a weak constitution, or simply as being in a condition that required removal from society into an institution where they could be managed and where they would cause no embarrassment to the households that had employed them. The connection between the governess's position and mental illness was noted by Victorian writers and reformers with a frequency that tells you something. Harriet Martineau, the radical journalist and social theorist, wrote in the 1850s about the psychological damage done to women by the combination of education and enforced idleness, or in the governess's case, education and enforced subordination. She argued that the governess was placed in a situation uniquely designed to produce psychological suffering, isolated from her social equals, deprived of meaningful authority over her own life, expected to suppress her emotions and desires completely, with no prospect of improvement and no legitimate outlet for the intelligence that her education had developed. The records of Victorian asylums, that grim archive of the period's most extreme social exclusions, contain the names of women whose occupation was recorded as governess. They are there in disproportionate numbers, relative to the general population, the women who had held the composure too long and at too great a cost and had eventually, privately or publicly, let it go. The diagnoses they were given were the diagnoses of the period: hysteria, melancholy, religious mania, delusion, moral insanity. These categories were broad enough to contain almost anything that a Victorian doctor or a Victorian family found difficult to manage, and they were applied to women with a frequency and a looseness that tells you less about the women's actual condition than about the society's need to classify and contain behaviour it found disturbing. What that behaviour actually was in many cases was simply distress. A woman who had been dismissed without reference after 12 years of service, and who had no savings and no family to return to, and no prospect of another position might well be distressed. A woman who had been required to maintain a cheerful composure for 20 years in households that ignored her might well have a moment of not maintaining it. A woman who had been expected to suppress her intelligence and her ambition and her desires for the entirety of her adult life might well, at some point, find the suppression intolerable. Charlotte Bronte understood this. The madwoman in the attic in Jane Eyre, Bertha Mason, the first wife hidden on the upper floor of Thornfield Hall, is not simply a Gothic device. She is, as feminist literary critics from Jean Rhys to Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar have argued, a figure for everything that the governess was required to suppress. She is the rage and the sexuality and the wildness and the refusal that Jane Eyre cannot afford to express in her careful navigation of the social world below. She is what happens when the suppression fails. She is there, burning, in the house where the governess lives her quiet and careful life, and eventually she burns the house down. The madwoman in the attic was not entirely fictional. She had her real counterparts. Women who had held it together for so long that when they finally stopped holding it together, the release was total and the consequences irreversible. Women who had been placed in institutions not because they were genuinely mentally ill in any meaningful sense, but because they were inconvenient, because they had made scenes or refused their position, or behaved in ways that the households where they worked found impossible to manage. The Victorian legal system gave husbands and brothers and employers of women enormous power to have those women certified and committed, and that power was exercised not always but with a frequency that should trouble us. There is a particular horror in the story of the governess who ended in an institution, because it represents the complete inversion of her initial promise. She had been educated. She had been given, relatively speaking, more intellectual formation than almost any woman of her class and time. And that education, that gift, had been used to fit her for a position that then spent 20 or 30 years systematically undermining everything the education had built. The intelligence had no proper outlet. The ambition had no proper object. The personality had no proper expression. And eventually, in some cases, the pressure found a way out. Jean Rhys revisited this story in 1966 in Wide Sargasso Sea, giving Bertha Mason her own voice and her own history, transforming her from a Gothic monster into a woman with a past and a perspective, a woman who had been shaped by forces she did not control and who had responded to her confinement in the only way available to her. It is one of the most powerful reimaginings in 20th century fiction, precisely because it insists on the humanity of the figure that Victorian fiction had written as a symbol of danger and irrationality. She was a person. She'd been made mad, or something like it, by a system that had no use for her except as property, and then found her inconvenient when she refused that definition. This is the darkest part of the story, and we should not linger in it unnecessarily, but we should not pass by it without acknowledgement. The system that created the governess created also the conditions for her breakdown, and some of them broke, and that breaking was not a personal failing, but a human response to conditions that would have tested anyone. She was not weak. She was trapped, and there is a difference, though the Victorian period consistently refused to make it. Here is the twist that history forgot to emphasise, or perhaps chose to underemphasise because it complicated the narrative of the governess as victim. Some of them were extraordinary, not despite their position, but in some sense because of it. The schoolroom, that small room on the upper floor, was also a laboratory, a place where a woman of intelligence and curiosity spent years thinking carefully about how minds worked, and how knowledge was transmitted, and what education actually was and could be. And some of those women took that thinking and turned it into something that changed the world. Mary Wollstonecraft had been a governess, briefly and unhappily, in the household of the Viscount Kingsborough in Ireland in 1786. She hated the position with a passion that her letters from the period document in terms that are remarkable for their directness. She was not suited to subordination, and she knew it, and the experience of being required to be subordinate when she was clearly more intelligent than most of the people she was subordinate to, seems to have clarified something for her about the nature of the system she was fighting. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, is in some sense the book that the governess position made possible, not because Wollstonecraft was grateful for the experience, but because the experience gave her the precise and personal knowledge of what women's subjection cost that her argument required. Nellie Wheaton, whose remarkable journal from the early 19th century was only rediscovered and published in the 1930s, worked as a governess for several years in the 1700s and 1800s, and recorded her experience with a candour that the period rarely permitted. Her journal is a document of extraordinary intelligence and perception, full of observations about the households she worked in, the children she taught, and the society around her that belong in the tradition of the great English essayists, rather than in the private notebooks of an underpaid schoolroom teacher. She never published in her lifetime. She never had the opportunity. But she wrote, and the writing survived, and it is as fine a piece of social observation as the period produced. The women who founded the first proper schools for girls in the second half of the 19th century were often women who had spent time as governesses, or who had been taught by governesses and understood from the inside what the private schoolroom system cost and failed to provide. Dorothea Beale, who founded the Cheltenham Ladies' College and ran it from 1858 to 1906, had been educated at home by governesses and had early in her career taught at a school before taking up the Cheltenham position. Her vision for what girls' education could and should be was sharpened by her precise understanding of what it currently was: fragmented, underfunded, socially rather than intellectually motivated, and in the hands of women who had been given barely enough education to teach the subjects they were employed to teach. Frances Buss, who founded the North London Collegiate School in 1850, had a more directly relevant personal history. She had supported her family through teaching from an early age and understood the economic precarity of women's educational work from her own experience. Her school was the first to charge affordable fees and admit girls from middle-class families who could not afford the private governess, but needed something better than the dame schools that were the only other option. She was, in a direct and practical sense, addressing the governess problem by creating an alternative to it. These women are remembered. Their schools still stand. Their contributions to the history of women's education are documented and celebrated, but there were hundreds more whose names did not survive, who did their work in smaller ways and left no record beyond the children they taught. Women who brought to the schoolroom a genuine intellectual seriousness that the children encountered nowhere else. Women who introduced their pupils to ideas that the drawing room would never have offered. Women who taught not merely the accomplishments required by the position, but something of how to think, how to question, how to take seriously the life of the mind. There is a governess who appears briefly in the family memoir of a late Victorian household, identified only by her initials and the single detail that she was Hungarian. She had come to England, the memoir records, after some unspecified difficulty in her own country, and she had brought with her a knowledge of European literature and history and philosophy that went considerably beyond what a standard English schoolroom required. The children she taught remembered her decades later as the most intellectually formative influence of their childhood. She had told them about Goethe and Schiller and the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She had made them read German. She had discussed with them, the memoir says, ideas that they had never encountered before, that made them feel the world was larger and stranger, and more interesting than the drawing room had suggested. Then she left as they all left, and the family lost touch with her, and her name, if it was ever fully recorded, has been lost. But something of what she gave those children remained, and the children grew up carrying it, and the ideas she introduced persisted in the minds she had shaped, unnamed and unattributed, but real. This is the hidden intellectual history of the Victorian governess, the contribution that could not be measured or credited because it happened in a room the world did not consider important, between a woman whose name is not remembered and children who grew up to be somebody else's story. The twist is this: the woman who was told she was nobody, who was paid as though her work was worth almost nothing, who was housed in the least significant room of the house and excluded from the social life of the family she served, was in many cases the most intellectually consequential person in that household. She was the one who shaped the minds that would go on to shape other things. She was the one doing the actual work of civilization, the transmission of knowledge and the formation of thinking persons. while the family whose name everyone remembered sat in the drawing room below and took the credit for producing children of unusual quality. The story of the Victorian governess is usually told as an English story. The grey London house, the rain on the windows, the coal smoke, the upper floor. And it is an English story, rooted in the specific conditions of Victorian England, its class structure and its gender conventions and its particular form of hypocritical respectability. But it is also a colonial story, and that dimension has been almost entirely erased from the popular account. The British Empire in the 19th century was vast, and it was administered by a class of men and their families who lived their working lives at considerable distance from England. India, which was the jewel in the imperial crown and the posting that carried the greatest prestige and the greatest mortality, was home to tens of thousands of British families at any given moment. The wives and children of administrators and officers and merchants and missionaries lived in the cantonments and hill stations of a country that was in most respects nothing like England, and they required, for the education of their children, someone who could maintain the standards of English learning and English culture in conditions that made those standards difficult to sustain. Enter the governess. She went to India in considerable numbers, hired by families who paid slightly better than English households because the hardship of the posting required some additional inducement, and who provided passage money and accommodation as part of the arrangement. She went to Australia, where the pastoral families of the sheep stations were rich enough to want private education for their children, and remote enough from any town that a school was impossible. She went to South Africa and Canada and the Caribbean, to any corner of the empire where a British family of sufficient means needed someone to teach their children French and music, and the geography of a world that from those locations could seem very far away. Her experience in these postings was in some ways continuous with her experience in England, the same schoolroom in the upper floor, the same ambiguous social position, the same careful management of her own emotions in someone else's house. But there were also differences, some of them striking, and some of them deeply troubling. In the colonies, the social distinctions that structured English life were stretched and distorted by the very different conditions of colonial society. The precise hierarchy of class that made the governess's position so carefully defined in England was harder to maintain in a hill station in India or on a sheep station in Queensland. The governess sometimes found, in these postings, a social position that was marginally less constrained than what she had known at home, simply because the colonial context had disrupted the usual rules. But the colonial context also introduced new dimensions of complexity that the English story does not contain. The governess in India was not simply a class anomaly, she was also a racial category, a white woman in a racially stratified society, and her position in that society was determined by race as well as by class and gender. She occupied a kind of intermediate racial position that the colonial hierarchy had complicated relationships with. She was white, which meant she belonged at some level to the ruling caste. She was poor, which meant she did not belong to it in the way that mattered. She was educated, which gave her a claim to consideration. She was a woman, which limited what she could do with that claim. The children she taught in colonial households were children who were growing up in a world in which the subordination of non-white people was not a distant political abstraction, but the daily operational reality of the society around them, and she was often the person who taught them. What did she teach them about this? The curriculum was the standard English one, French and geography and music and drawing. It did not, in most cases, explicitly address the colonial situation, but the geography lessons placed England at the centre of the map and the empire at the periphery, and the history lessons celebrated British achievement and treated the peoples of the colonised world as supporting characters in someone else's story, and the culture that she transmitted was a culture that understood itself as superior. Some governesses were more aware of this than others. The records are fragmentary, and the voices of the most critical are the hardest to recover, because criticism of the colonial enterprise was not a safe position for a woman in her situation. But there are hints. A governess in India in the 1870s who wrote privately about the discomfort of her position, the way the colonial hierarchy sat uncomfortably against her own experience of being treated as less than she was. a governess in Jamaica in the 1850s, whose letters home contain observations about the society around her that suggest a more complicated response to the colonial world than the standard narrative allowed. She was teaching the children of empire to be the inheritors of empire. This was part of her job, though nobody said it in quite those terms, and she did it, as she did everything, with the competence and the composure that her position required. But in the margins of the story, in the letters she wrote late at night, and the diary entries she made when nobody was looking, there are traces of a woman who knew more than she was supposed to say, who understood more than the official version acknowledged, and who carried that understanding quietly, in the same way she carried everything else, without a name for it and without a proper place to put it down. There is a moment in Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, published in 1898, that has troubled readers since it was written. The governess, unnamed and alone in a remote country house with two beautiful and strangely knowing children, begins to see ghosts. Or she believes she sees ghosts, or the children are somehow connected to the ghosts, or she herself is the problem. James refused to resolve the ambiguity, and the refusal is the point. The Turn of the Screw is the most famous of a subgenre that did not have a name but that formed, in retrospect, a distinct tradition within Victorian and Edwardian fiction, the governess ghost story. In these stories, which appeared in the sensation novels of the 1860s and in the ghost story periodicals that became popular in the latter part of the century, the governess was consistently the figure through whom the supernatural entered the household. She saw things the family did not see. She knew things she should not know. She was connected somehow to the darkness in the house, the secrets in the upper floor, the things that had been hidden away and were now beginning to make themselves felt. Why the governess? Why was this quiet woman in her grey dress the figure through whom Victorian literature chose to explore the uncanny? Part of the answer is practical. She lived in the house, but was not of the family. She occupied the upper floors, the attic rooms, the spaces of the house that were furthest from the domestic centre of warmth and social life. She was present at hours when the family was absent, awake in the deep night with the children she watched over, inhabiting the house in ways that the family itself did not. If there were things in the house that only became visible in the dark or in the silence or in the spaces that social life did not reach, she was the person most likely to encounter them. But the deeper answer is psychological. The governess was the figure of repressed knowledge in the Victorian household. She knew things. She saw what happened between the family members when they were not performing for each other. She saw the marriage's silences and the children's fears and the household's small daily hypocrisies. She heard through the walls of her upper room conversations she was not supposed to hear. She was, in her very marginality, a witness to the truth of the house. And truth is always slightly uncanny in a social world that depends on the maintenance of comfortable fictions. In the ghost stories, the governess's knowledge becomes supernatural. The things she knows, the things the family has buried or denied or refused to look at directly, take the form of apparitions that only she can see. She is haunted by the family's secrets. The ghosts are the return of what has been repressed, and the governess is the consciousness in which that return occurs, because she is the only one in the household who does not have a sufficient investment in the fiction to look away. Charlotte Brontë understood this intuitively. Thornfield Hall, in Jane Eyre, is a haunted house. The haunting is literal. There is a woman in the attic. But the haunting is also figurative. The house is haunted by everything that Rochester has refused to deal with. The first marriage and its consequences. The life he has chosen to live rather than the life he's actually got. Jane, the governess, is the figure who must eventually bring the hidden thing into the light, because she is the only person in the household whose position is defined by truthful seeing rather than comfortable blindness. The Victorian governess ghost story is, in this reading, not primarily about the supernatural at all. It is about knowledge and power, and the particular danger of a woman who sees clearly in a household that depends on not being seen clearly. The ghost is the truth the family cannot face. The governess is the medium through which it speaks. And the horror of the story is not the apparition itself, but the social reality that the apparition represents. The things done in houses that someone always knows about. The things suppressed that always, eventually find a way to surface. There was another dimension to the governess ghost story that the psychological reading sometimes misses. She was herself a kind of ghost. She was present but invisible, there but not acknowledged, inhabiting the household in the way that ghosts are said to inhabit places, without ownership, without the full rights of presence, carrying something that she could not quite put down. The children saw her. The family looked through her. She moved through rooms that were not hers, in a life that had been arranged around her but not for her, and she persisted in this spectral state year after year, accumulating the particular history of a life that leaves no monument. When the governess ghost stories kill her, or drive her mad, or reveal her as the ghost herself, they are doing something that Victorian society did to the governess's actual existence. They are making her disappearance the point of the story. She was always, in those households, someone who would eventually go, who would be replaced by another woman in another grey dress, who would leave no trace in the family's official history. The ghost story simply made this explicit, gave it a dramatic shape, allowed the culture to acknowledge the expendability that it preferred not to name directly. But she was not a ghost. This is the final, most important point. She was a person. She was specific, individual, irreplaceable in her own particular way, possessing a history and a perspective, and a set of relationships and a quality of mind that belonged to no one else. The system that treated her as interchangeable, that looked through her rather than at her, was wrong not just ethically, but factually. She was there. She was real. She existed in rooms that she has since largely vacated, leaving behind only the faint traces that archives preserve, the handwriting in old letters, the names in charity registers, the brief biographical footnotes in the family histories of the families she served. But she was there, and the world she lived in, for all its constraints and its cruelties, was genuinely inhabited by her, and she was genuinely present in it, and that presence, quiet and careful, and largely unacknowledged as it was a form of reality that no ghost story can adequately represent. She was there. And what she gave in those upper rooms, to those children, in those long, patient hours, was real and specific, and hers to give, and it was given, and it mattered, and in some small way that the records have almost entirely failed to preserve, it endures. Every system of constraint produces its escapees, not many, not easily, but the Victorian governess's world, for all its careful construction of dependency, was not entirely without exits, and some women found them. Marriage was the most obvious exit, and the one that Victorian society most approved of, though it also regarded it with some ambivalence when the marriage in question was to someone above the governess's station. A governess who married well, who attracted the attention of an eligible man with sufficient income to support her, could leave the schoolroom behind and enter the drawing room as a participant rather than a piece of furniture. This happened. Not as often as the novel suggested, but it happened. The interesting cases are the ones that did not involve marriage. The women who found other exits, less conventional, more difficult, but genuinely theirs. They existed, and their stories, where they can be recovered, are among the most compelling in the history of Victorian women. Some went abroad, not to the colonies as governesses, but as emigrants, as women who understood that the social hierarchy that trapped them in England did not necessarily extend to the new worlds that were being built in Australia and New Zealand and North America. A woman with education and competence and a willingness to work hard could find, in these newer societies, a position that English convention denied her. She could run a school. She could teach as a professional, with a salary and a status that acknowledged her qualification. She could, in some circumstances, own property and manage her own financial affairs, with a freedom that England's legal system did not permit until late in the century. The women who went in this direction were not typically the ones who'd been most ground down by the system. You needed resources to emigrate, material and psychological, and the most economically precarious governesses often lack the means for the passage and the courage for the uncertainty of arrival. The women who left were often the younger ones, the ones who had not yet been fully broken in, who had enough left of their original energy and ambition to imagine a different life and pursue it. Some women found exits through writing. The literary world was not entirely closed to women, though it was not easy, and the governess who wrote, who took the intelligence and the careful observation that the position had developed and turned them toward prose or poetry, occupied a position that was at once more exposed and more genuinely hers than anything the schoolroom had offered. They published initially under male pseudonyms or under initials that concealed their gender, because the literary market was more hospitable to men, and because a woman known to be writing for publication could damage her reputation as a governess. The Bronte sisters themselves published first as Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. But the writing was real, and for some of them, the writing became the exit. Charlotte Bronte left governessing permanently after the success of Jane Eyre. She remained in many ways marked by the experience, writing from it and about it and through it for the rest of her literary career. But she was no longer in the schoolroom. She was somewhere else entirely, a place that the schoolroom had prepared her for and that the schoolroom would never on its own have been enough to give her. Elizabeth Missing Sewell, whose novels of the 1840s and 50s explored the moral and spiritual lives of Victorian women with considerable subtlety, had worked as a teacher and drawn on that experience throughout her fiction. Dinah Mulock Craik, whose John Halifax Gentleman was one of the best-selling novels of the 1850s, had supported herself and her mother through writing and teaching from an early age, and understood the economics of women's labour from personal experience. These women wrote their way out, or partially out, of the trap. The writing was not just artistic expression, it was an exit strategy. Some found their escape through the very reform movements that the governess question had helped to generate. The women who built the new schools and the women's colleges, who argued before parliamentary committees and wrote the pamphlets, and organised the campaigns for women's education and women's employment. Many of them had started in the schoolroom and carried from it a precise and personal knowledge of what the old system cost. Their escape was not private but collective, and it created as its product a world somewhat less likely to trap the next generation of educated women in the same way. The woman who had been a governess and who became, in later life, a teacher in one of the new board schools or a lecturer at a women's college, or the matron of a girls' school, had not escaped the work of teaching. She was still teaching. But the conditions of that teaching were different in kind from the schoolroom's conditions. She had colleagues, she had professional standing, she had a salary that reflected her qualification, she had a place in the world that was defined by her competence rather than by her social function as someone else's employee. The work was the same, its meaning had changed. There is something quietly triumphant about these stories, something that the more familiar narrative of the governess as victim tends to obscure. Not triumphant in the grand Victorian sense of wealth or status or visible success. Triumphant in the smaller, more durable sense of having made something for yourself out of the materials you were given, of having found, within the constraints, a version of freedom that was genuinely yours. She was not given much to work with. She worked with it anyway, and some of what she made has lasted longer than the households that employed her. The Victorian governess was an English invention, but she was not an exclusively English problem. Across the Channel, and further south, educated women of the bourgeoisie faced variations of the same trap, shaped by the specific conditions of their own societies, but recognisably similar in their essential mechanism. An education that fitted women for a life of leisure, that poverty then denied them, leaving them with nothing to sell but the accomplishments that the education had given them. In France, the gouvernante occupied a position broadly analogous to her English counterpart, though the precise social geometry was different. The French class system was rigid in its own ways, reshaped by the Revolution and the various regimes that had followed it but never entirely dismantled, and the educated Frenchwoman of modest means found herself in a similar position to her English equivalent, too refined for manual work, too poor for idleness, with a schoolroom as her only market. The wages were similarly inadequate, the social ambiguity was similarly uncomfortable. The novels of the period, from Balzac through to Zola, returned repeatedly to the figure of the impoverished educated woman navigating the cruelties of class. In Spain, the preceptora, the woman hired to teach the children of bourgeois and aristocratic families, occupied an especially precarious position, because the Spanish society of the mid-19th century offered women even fewer alternatives than its English or French equivalents. The Church had traditionally provided some women with an institutional life outside the family, but the various anti-clerical movements of the century had complicated that option. The legal status of Spanish women was, if anything, more restricted than that of English women, and the economic opportunities available to them narrower still. The Spanish governess was caught in the same trap as the English one, with fewer tools to break it. The English governess abroad, the woman hired by wealthy European families who wanted their children to learn English as a mark of cosmopolitan sophistication, occupied a peculiar third position in these European contexts. She was English, which in many parts of 19th century Europe carried a certain cachet, an association with the industrial and commercial dominance that made England the most powerful nation on earth in this period. She was therefore treated sometimes with a slightly more visible respect than her counterparts of the local nationality received. But she was also foreign, without the social networks that provided what little safety the English governors could obtain, more isolated even than usual, and more vulnerable to the particular exploitation that isolation enables. There are accounts of English governesses in France and Germany and Italy and Russia, hired by aristocratic families for the specific purpose of teaching their children English, and finding themselves in households where the social conventions were different enough from what they knew to create new and unexpected difficulties, but where the essential dynamic of the position was unchanged. Too educated to be a servant, too poor to be a guest, a woman in a house where nobody quite knew what to do with her. The Russian case is particularly striking. The governess in Russian aristocratic households of the 19th century appears in the literature of the period with great frequency, most famously in the fiction of Tolstoy and Turgenev and Chekhov, where she's often a figure of both sympathy and comedy. A woman whose earnestness and European education sit awkwardly against the vast, chaotic, particular reality of Russian domestic life. Chekhov's governesses are perhaps the most precise, women of intelligence and sensitivity, who have been placed by economic necessity in situations that use neither quality, who manage their days with a kind of patient bewilderment, and whose inner lives are richer and more interesting than the households around them can perceive. What emerges from this European picture is not that the governess problem was an English peculiarity, but that it was the product of a specific stage in the history of women's education and economic life, a stage that most Western European societies passed through in the 19th century as education expanded, but the economic opportunities available to educated women lagged decades behind. The problem was the gap between what education had given women and what society was prepared to let them do with it, and that gap existed wherever educated women existed, and the old social structures had not yet been replaced by something adequate to their actual capabilities. The gap closed at different rates in different places. Scandinavia moved faster than Spain, England moved faster than Italy. The factors that determined the rate of change were complex, involving not just political will, but economic development, religious tradition, urbanization, and the presence or absence of women who were willing to argue publicly for change. But everywhere, eventually, the gap closed. The educated woman who had nowhere to go except the schoolroom of another family's house began to find other places to go, and the governess, as a social category, began its long, slow disappearance. She's almost gone now. She persists, in certain wealthy households, as a luxury and a tradition, and she persists in the literature and the films and the television dramas that return compulsively to the Victorian period and its tensions. But the social problem she represented, the 25,000 women trapped in someone else's schoolroom because there was nowhere else to go, has been solved. Not perfectly, not without creating new problems of its own. But the specific trap, the one built from a combination of education and poverty, and the systematic exclusion of women from any profession that might have offered them an alternative, no longer operates in the way it once did. This should be said clearly at the end of this long telling, because it is the most important thing. The trap was broken. It did not last forever. The women who fought against it, directly and indirectly, loudly and quietly, through novels and pamphlets and petitions and the patient daily work of the new schools and colleges, eventually won. The world changed, not because it was inevitable or natural or the product of some benign historical progress. It changed because people made it change, and many of those people were women who had sat in schoolrooms on upper floors and felt the trap close around them and decided, in their various ways, that it was not acceptable and acted accordingly. She is the ancestor of every woman who works as a professional today. Every woman who studies at a university, who practices medicine or law or any of the learned professions, who teaches in a school where she's paid a professional salary and holds a professional qualification, who manages her own finances and chooses her own life without requiring the permission of a husband or a father or an employer. She stands, in some sense, in the tradition that the governess question opened. The argument for women's education and women's economic independence was made, in part through the visible suffering of the governess, and the argument was eventually won, and the winning of it changed everything. There is a woman, let us call her simply the last governess, though she was not actually the last because there is no single last, and the fading of any institution is gradual and uneven. But let us say there is a woman who was working as a private governess in England in the 1930s, when the institution had already become a curiosity rather than a necessity, a holdover from the Victorian world that was maintained by a small number of wealthy conservative families who could afford it and who preferred the traditional arrangement for reasons that were partly educational and partly social, and partly simply a reluctance to abandon a practice that had been part of their household management for 3 or 4 generations. She was not 25 years old. She was not fleeing genteel poverty in quite the same way that her Victorian predecessors had fled it. She had, or could have had, other options. The expanding teaching profession in state schools, the clerical work that the typewriter had made available to women, the retail and service positions that had multiplied with the commercial expansion of the interwar period. She had chosen the governess position, or settled into it, for reasons that were particular to her own circumstances, and she worked in a house that was already, in the 1930s, a kind of historical survival, a household organised on Victorian principles in a world that had moved a long way past them. She would have been aware, if she was a reading woman, of the history she was inhabiting. Jane Eyre would have been available to her. Agnes Grey. The century of debate and argument and reform that had transformed the position of women in English society. She would have known, sitting in her upper room in a house that still called it the schoolroom, that the world outside that room was different from the world her predecessors had lived in. She could vote since 1928. She could attend university if she had the means and the qualification. She could train as a teacher or a nurse or a secretary or any of a dozen other professions that had not been available to women a generation ago. She was there by choice, or by a kind of inertia, or by the specific economic circumstances of the 1930s, the Depression years when choice was constrained for everyone, and the security of a residential position, with meals and accommodation provided, was not to be dismissed. She was there with a history that she may or may not have thought about much, the history of the 25,000 women who had occupied similar rooms in similar houses in the decades before her, who had sat at similar deal tables and taught similar children, and navigated similar social ambiguities without any of the protections that the intervening decades had built. When she left, finally, whether by dismissal or by choice, or by the simple end of the need for her services, she stepped into a world that was wider, significantly, than the world that had awaited her predecessors. She was not without options. The trap had been dismantled, at least partially, at least for her generation in her country. She could go somewhere else, and be something else, and the something else was not nothing. What does it mean to be the last of something? Not the last in the sense of the final individual, because the private governess did not disappear entirely in any particular year, but the last in the sense of the last typical case, the last woman for whom the position represented not a personal eccentricity, but a social norm, the product of a system rather than of individual circumstance. The last governess who stood in the line of all the others, who inhabited the tradition without knowing she was inhabiting it, who was, in her daily work of French verbs and geography, and careful patience with someone else's children, the last iteration of something that had been going on for 100 years. She closed the schoolroom door behind her, down the stairs, out of the house, into a world that did not quite remember why the room at the top of the house was shaped the way it was, why the floors had been arranged the way they had been arranged, why there was a small bedroom adjacent to the schoolroom that had no fire and no view, and was just large enough for a single bed and a modest writing table, and a chest of drawers with not many drawers. She was gone, and the room was quiet and the dust settled on the deal table, and the globe sat on its shelf with its painted oceans catching the last of the afternoon light, turning slightly in the draught from the door she'd left ajar, the way you do when you are leaving a place for the last time and want to leave it open. Not quite closed, not quite finished, still somehow available for the person who might come next and find it useful. But no one came. The schoolroom was converted eventually into a bedroom or a study or a bathroom, as old houses are always converting their historic rooms into spaces that the present finds more useful. The globe was stored in the attic or given to a church sale or simply lost, as objects are lost when the life that gave them meaning has been replaced by a different kind of life. The deal table was taken away. The smell of chalk faded. What remained was everything that had happened there, the invisible residue of 1,000 morning lessons, the scratch of pens on paper, the small triumphs of a child understanding something for the first time, the long patient hours of a woman who had given what she had to give and received. In return, almost nothing that the world counted as valuable. What remained was real, even if it could not be measured or displayed or credited to her name. What remained was the slight but genuine difference that careful teaching makes, spread invisibly through the minds of the children who had sat at that table, and through their children, and through the world those children made. She was gone. She had been there. The world was different, marginally and genuinely, for her having been there, in the way that the world is always different for the presence of anyone who did their work honestly and well, even in difficult circumstances, even without recognition, even in a room at the top of the house that nobody comes to anymore. History has a habit of asking the wrong people. It asks the employers rather than the employed, the families rather than the women who served them, the masters of the house rather than the woman on the upper floor. The Victorian governess in the historical record is largely seen from the outside, through the eyes of the families who hired her, through the social commentators who analysed her situation, through the novelists who transformed her into fiction. What is harder to recover, but not impossible, is how she appeared to the children. What did they see from their side of the schoolroom table? What did they carry forward into their adult lives from the years they spent in her company? The answer, when you go looking for it in the memoirs and letters and diaries of the men and women who had been educated by governesses, is surprising in its consistency. Not surprising in the content necessarily, but surprising in its emotional weight. The governess was remembered. Not always fondly, not always clearly, sometimes with a residual guilt that the adult writer found difficult to account for, but remembered. With a vividness and a specificity that suggests something more than the ordinary adult recall of childhood education. She had mattered to them, even when they had not been kind to her, especially perhaps when they had not been kind to her. There is a pattern that emerges from these accounts. The child who had been difficult, the child who had refused to learn, or had been actively cruel, or had tested the governess's patience beyond what any patience should reasonably be expected to bear, often became the adult who remembered her most clearly and most painfully. There was a quality of unfinished business in these memories, a sense that something had been done that could not be undone, that the cruelty of a child exercised against a woman who could not respond to it without losing her position had left a mark that decades had not entirely erased. One Victorian memoir, written by a man who had been a notably difficult child in the 1860s and who'd gone on to a distinguished career in the law, contains a passage about his governess that is remarkable for its late-life candour. He describes her, whose name he gives as Miss Holford, as a woman of obvious intelligence and great patience who had been made, by the conventions of the household, almost entirely powerless, and who had responded to his sustained campaign of obstruction and contempt with a quality of forbearance that he had, at the time, interpreted as weakness, and that he understood, 40 years later, as something considerably closer to heroism. He had never found out what had happened to her. He had asked his mother when his mother was very old, and his mother had not remembered her clearly. She had left when he was about 12, and there had been no further communication. This is the typical ending. She left. There was no further communication. The child grew up and the governess disappeared into the general past, leaving behind only the education she had provided and the memories she had made, credited to neither account. Some children were kind. Some children remembered and went looking. There are cases in the correspondence files of the governess's benevolent institution of former pupils who wrote to inquire about a woman who had taught them in their childhood, who had heard she was in difficulties and wanted to help, who felt a loyalty to her that the years had not dissolved. These cases are moving in their particularity. A woman writing in the 1880s to ask about a governess who had taught her in the 1850s, 30 years ago, who had given her a love of literature that had been the great private sustenance of her life, who had been the only person in her childhood household who had spoken to her as though her mind mattered. Did the institution know where she was? Could something be done? Sometimes something could be done. Sometimes the woman being asked about was already dead, or could not be traced, or was beyond the reach of what a letter could accomplish. But sometimes she was found, and the connection was remade, and the child who had grown up carried the governess into the last years of her life. The small annuity, or the regular visit, or the correspondence that told her she had not been entirely invisible after all. These are the stories that the official history least often tells, perhaps because they are so small, so private. So resistant to the larger narratives about systems and structures and social change, they are just two people, a woman who had taught and a person who had been taught. The private arithmetic of care given and received, tallied up finally in old age, imperfectly but genuinely. What the children learned from the governess was not always what she intended to teach. This is the way of all education, and it applies to the schoolroom on the upper floor no less than to any other learning environment. They learned French, some of them, or at least enough French to be useful on the continent in later life. They learned geography and the elements of arithmetic and how to hold a pen and how to pass a sentence. They learned the accomplishments that the position required, the music and the drawing and the deportment and the careful social performance of a person of good family. But they also learned, from the particular woman who sat at the other side of the table, things that were not in any curriculum. They learned what it looked like to manage difficulty with patience. They learned what it looked like to maintain dignity when dignity was not being offered in return. They learned, some of them, that the world was arranged in ways that were not entirely just, and that some people bore the weight of that injustice with a composure that was not the same thing as acceptance, that composed and accepting were two different states that the surface appearance could not distinguish. They learned, from watching her, something about the inner life of a person in a constrained position, something about what it cost to be what she was in that house, and that knowledge, imperfectly absorbed and rarely consciously articulated, was part of what they took with them out of the schoolroom into their adult lives. Some of the children who remembered their governesses most clearly were women who had gone on to be involved in the women's education movement. Dorothea Beale had been educated by governesses before her time at Queen's College. Her understanding of what private schoolroom education was and was not, what it provided and what it failed to provide, was part of what drove her vision for Cheltenham Ladies' College. Her conviction that girls deserved something more systematic and more academically serious than the accomplished young woman hired for a year could give them. Her governess had given her something. It was not enough. The fact of its not being enough was itself a kind of education. There were children, too, who became writers, who found in the figure of their governess a subject rich enough to return to throughout their working lives. The governess appears in the fiction of writers who had been taught by governesses with a frequency that suggests she had impressed herself on the imagination in ways that outlasted the schoolroom. Rudyard Kipling, Henry James, Virginia Woolf, all children of Victorian households who had spent time in the company of women employed to teach them, all returned to the figure of the educated woman in a constrained position, in various forms throughout their literary careers. She was part of what they knew about the world, absorbed in childhood, processed over decades into the material of their art. Virginia Woolf's governess, whose name was Janet Case, and who later became a distinguished classical scholar and teacher, was not a typical case, because the Woolf household was not a typical Victorian household, and Janet Case's position was somewhat different from the conventional governesses. But the relationship between Woolf and Case was a significant one, lasting beyond the schoolroom into a genuine adult friendship, and it seems to have given Woolf a particular sensitivity to the situation of the educated woman, denied the full use of her education that runs through much of her feminist writing. A Room of One's Own, published in 1929, is in some sense the argument that the governess situation had been making for 80 years, made finally by someone with the position and the platform to make it heard. The children remembered. Not all of them, not always clearly, not always kindly. But the woman in the upper room had made an impression, and impressions persist. Long after the households were gone and the families dispersed and the houses converted into flats or demolished for new development, long after the names had faded from the records and the last of the deal tables had been taken to the bonfire, what the governess had given the children was still there, somewhere in the way they thought and the things they valued and the small habits of mind that good teaching leaves behind. Unnamed and uncredited and invisible in the account books of history, but there, let us talk, directly and without sentiment, about money. Because the story of the Victorian governess is, at its foundation, an economic story, and the economic story has dimensions that the more comfortable historical accounts tend to avoid. The governess was paid between £20 and £100 a year. We have established this. What we have not fully examined is what this wage represented in terms of the value of the labour it purchased, the gap between what she produced and what she received, and what that gap tells us about the Victorian economy's relationship to the labour of educated women. Begin with what she produced. A governess educated children. In the households that employed her, she was the primary educator of the family's daughters, and often the primary educator of the younger sons as well, before they were sent to school. She taught languages, music, drawing, geography, history, arithmetic, and the social accomplishments that marked a child of good family. She did this for 6 days a week, for most of the year, for as many years as the children required her services. She was, in economic terms, a highly skilled worker, providing a service of considerable value to the households that employed her. How considerable? Consider what the alternative cost. A boy sent to a good public school in the 1860s paid fees of somewhere between £50 and £150 a year, depending on the school, and this bought him a formal education delivered by qualified men who had themselves been educated at universities. A girl sent to one of the new girls' schools that were beginning to appear in the 1860s and 70s paid somewhat less, in schools like the North London Collegiate or Cheltenham, but still a significant sum. The governess, who provided a comparable service privately in the home, was paid less than the school fees that would have purchased an equivalent education. This is the first economic peculiarity. The labour of the governess was worth more in market terms than the market was paying for it. The wage she received was suppressed by the oversupply of educated women relative to the available positions, but it was suppressed below the actual market rate for comparable educational services, not just to a lower rate within the same market. The family that paid a governess £30 a year was receiving educational services for their daughters that would have cost them considerably more if delivered through any other available channel. The governess was subsidising the education of the families she worked for. The second economic peculiarity concerns the hidden costs of the position. The governess's wage was presented as including accommodation and meals, which were described as a significant benefit in addition to the cash payment. This framing was not entirely dishonest, but it was misleading in its presentation of the numbers. The accommodation provided was, as we've seen, a small room on the upper floor, without fire in most cases except in the coldest weather. The meals were the family's meals, which meant that the governess was fed at the family's table, or the children's table, a benefit that was real but that came attached to the social complications we have already described. What the accommodation and meals framing concealed was the other cost the governess bore. She was expected to dress respectably, which cost money. She paid for her own postage and stationery, which cost money. She was expected to travel to and from positions at her own expense, which could be a significant cost on a £30 salary. If she required medical attention, she paid for it herself in most cases, unless the family was unusually generous. If she wished to improve her qualifications, to attend evening classes or purchase books or access the lectures that were beginning to be available to women in the larger cities, she paid for this herself. And then there was the cost that no one calculated because no one acknowledged it as a cost at all, the cost of the unpaid overtime. A governess's official duties were the children's education during school hours, but in practice she was available beyond those hours, for the supervision of the children in the evenings when the parents were out, for the management of the children during family travel, for the additional lessons required when a child was falling behind, for the 100 small tasks that the presence of an educated, available woman in the household made it natural to assign to her. None of this additional work was reflected in her wage. It was simply assumed to be part of the position. The economist term for this kind of labour is unpaid reproductive labour, the work of care and education and household management that makes economic life possible, but is not counted in the official calculations of productivity and value. The Victorian governess was performing it in a context that made its true value particularly visible, because she was being paid something, just not much, and the gap between the something she received and the something that her work was actually worth could be calculated, approximately, from the comparison with other forms of educational provision. That gap was substantial. A rough calculation, using the available figures for school fees and private tuition rates in Victorian England, suggests that the typical governess was receiving perhaps 40 to 60% of the market rate for comparable educational services. The rest was extracted by the employing family in the form of the social arrangements that kept the governess's wages low. The oversupply of candidates, the absence of any professional qualification or licensing system that would have given her bargaining power, the social conventions that prevented her from leaving the position without a reference, and therefore gave the employer almost unlimited power over the terms of her employment. This extraction was not experienced by the employing families as exploitation, It was experienced, if it was thought about at all, as the natural order of things. The governess was paid what governesses were paid. The market set the wage. If the wage seemed low, that was the market's judgment on the value of the service, not the family's judgment on the value of the woman. This reasoning, which will be familiar to anyone who has spent time thinking about how markets work and whose interests they serve, was as comfortable and as wrong in the 1860s as it is now. The third economic peculiarity is the most troubling and the least often examined. The governess's poverty was, in a direct and calculable sense, a subsidy to the families she worked for. The families who employed governesses at £30 a year and paid for their daughters' education at a fraction of its market cost used the savings to maintain the standard of living that their class position required. The governess's suppressed wage was converted, in the family's economy, into drawing-room furniture and dinner parties, and the children's music lessons with the superior teacher brought in for that purpose, and the annual subscription to the circulating library. The governess's poverty funded the family's respectability. This is not a comfortable observation, and it was not one that Victorian social commentary was willing to make directly, even in the period when the governess question was being most actively debated. The reformers who argued for better wages and professional qualifications for governesses made their argument in terms of justice and of the waste of human capacity, but they were cautious about pointing directly to the economic interests that the low wages served. Those economic interests were the interests of the class that read the newspapers and subscribed to the periodicals and attended the lectures where the arguments were being made. You could not call your audience exploiters and expect them to listen. By the end of the Victorian period, some economists and social theorists were beginning to develop the tools needed to analyse the situation more clearly. The concept of monopsony, a market in which a single buyer or a small group of buyers has sufficient power to set wages below the competitive rate, would have been applicable to the governess market, where the demand for governesses was spread across a large number of individual families, but the supply was concentrated among women who had essentially no alternatives and no collective bargaining power. The concept of unpaid labour and its relationship to the official economy was being developed by socialist theorists and early feminist economists. The full analytical apparatus was not yet available, but the pieces were assembling. What would it have looked like if the governess had been paid fairly? If her wage had reflected the actual market value of the educational services she provided, adjusted for the accommodation and meals provided, she might have earned something in the range of £60 to £80 a year rather than the 20 to 30 that most of them actually received. This would have been enough to save meaningfully over the course of a working life, enough to build the small capital base that would have allowed her to retire without destitution, enough to make the position economically viable rather than a slow slide toward the charity register. It would have required the employing families to spend more on their children's education, which would have meant spending less on something else, which is ultimately what the resistance to higher wages was about. The governess knew this, most of them, in the way that people who live close to economic reality always understand it more clearly than the comfortable people who benefit from their labour. She knew her work was worth more than she was paid for it. She knew the family below her could afford to pay more. She knew the drawing-room furniture and the extra footman and the summer in Brighton were purchased in part at her expense. She could not say this, or could not say it in any context where it would be heard, because the same social conventions that suppressed her wage also suppressed her ability to name what was happening to her. She carried the knowledge quietly, in the same way she carried everything else, and it did not make her more contented or less angry, but it did make her a great deal more clear-eyed about the world she lived in than the world gave her credit for. The economics of the governess's situation were not resolved by the gradual improvement of women's educational and professional opportunities, though that improvement helped. They were resolved in the end by the governess's disappearance as a category. When women had sufficient access to professional qualifications and professional employment that the oversupply of the governess market was absorbed into other occupations, the market itself contracted, and the women who remained as private tutors and governesses were able, gradually, to charge rates that more accurately reflected the value of what they did. The market, in other words, corrected itself when the conditions that had suppressed the wages were removed. But it is worth remembering, as we note this correction, that the correction came too late for the hundreds of thousands of women who had lived and died in the suppressed market. For them, the correction was not a historical footnote, but a lived condition, the daily arithmetic of a life in which the labour was real and the recognition was not, in which the value produced was substantial and the wage received was not, in which the gap between the two was filled by a composure that nobody was paying for because nobody had agreed to acknowledge that it cost anything at all. We have spent a long time looking at the governess from the outside, through the census numbers and the charity registers and the family memoirs and the social commentary and the novels that made her a symbol. Now let us try to hear her directly, in her own words, as far as the fragmentary record allows. The letters that survive from Victorian governesses fall into several categories, and the categories tell you something important about the conditions under which they were written. There are the formal letters, applications for positions, requests for references, correspondence with registry offices and charitable institutions. These are careful documents, written in the language of maximum respectability, designed to present the writer in the best possible light to a reader who held all the power in the exchange. They are not dishonest, exactly, but they are highly constructed, every word chosen to perform a version of the writer that would be acceptable to the conventions of the time. Then there are the family letters, written to mothers and sisters, and the occasional trusted friend, and these are somewhat different. Not entirely different. The Victorian letter was a public document in ways that we no longer fully appreciate. Letters were often read aloud in family gatherings, passed around among relations, preserved as part of the family record. A governess writing home knew that her letter might be read by people beyond its immediate recipient, and she calibrated accordingly. But family letters were also private in ways that formal correspondence was not, and in the gaps between the maintained composure there are glimpses of something closer to the actual experience. One such letter, written by a governess named Eleanor Smith to her sister in 1858, and preserved in a family archive, contains a passage that is worth sitting with. She writes, "The children are well and I believe making progress. Though progress with the youngest is slower than I could wish, she has a difficulty with written work that I am not entirely sure how to address. The family is from home this week, which means the house is very quiet, and I have had more time than usual to myself in the evenings. I've been reading again and thinking again, and I confess that thinking leads me to places where I do not wish to stay too long. You will understand what I mean. There is a sameness to the days here that I had not expected to find so wearing. Not unpleasant exactly, simply very still. I am well. Do not worry. I am well. Do not worry." This is the refrain of the governess's correspondence, the reassurance offered so consistently that it becomes, in its repetition, a kind of signal, a way of saying there is something I'm not telling you while maintaining the surface of the communication as normal. Eleanor Smith was clearly not entirely well in the sense that mattered. She was lonely and intellectually frustrated, and the days had a sameness that was wearing her down. But she had learned, as they all learned, to translate these conditions into the language of equanimity that the position required. I am well. Do not worry. Another letter from a governess identified in the archive only as M.H., written in the 1870s, is more direct. She writes to a friend, not a family member, which perhaps accounts for the greater candour. I have been thinking about what you said in your last, about whether the position is really what I ought to be doing, and I find I cannot answer you as simply as the question deserves. The honest answer is that I do not know what else I could be doing that would be better. The position is disagreeable in the ways we have discussed before, and you are right that Mrs. Ashworth treats me as something between a piece of furniture and a minor embarrassment. But the children are genuinely interesting to me, and I find I cannot be entirely unhappy in a room where a child is learning something. This is perhaps a weakness. It may be that I have made a kind of peace with the position that I should not have made, that I have accepted less than I deserve because accepting it requires less courage than fighting it. This is a remarkable piece of self-analysis for the 1870s, the recognition that she has made peace with something she ought not to have accepted. The honesty about the role of courage, or its absence, in her accommodation to the position. The ambivalence about whether the genuine satisfactions of the work constitute a justification for the conditions under which it is performed. She's thinking clearly and hard about her own situation, and she's not content with the comfortable simplifications that her official correspondence required. A third document, not a letter but a diary entry, written by a governess named Frances Parkes in the 1880s, addresses the question of what she wishes she had been able to do instead. If I had been born in some future time or in some other country, or simply into different circumstances, I think I should have liked to study medicine. I say this with some clarity because I have observed, in the households where I have worked, how illness proceeds and what the doctors do about it, and I find I can follow their reasoning and occasionally anticipate their conclusions in ways that suggest I have a capacity for this kind of thinking. But the capacity was never trained, because the capacity was in a woman, and women do not study medicine, or could not when I was of the age to have studied anything. By the time they could, I was 45, and the schoolroom had been my laboratory for 20 years. Frances Parks's diary is a document of controlled grief, a precise and intelligent woman accounting for the gap between what she might have been and what the circumstances of her birth permitted her to become. She is not despairing. She is not self-pitying. She is simply recording, with the same careful attention she brought to the schoolroom, the fact of what was lost and why it was lost, and what the loss cost. These voices are not easy to find. They are scattered across archives and family collections and the occasional published memoir, preserved by chance rather than by design, surviving because someone kept the letters or because the diary was not thrown away in the clearing of an estate. For every Frances Parks whose diary survived, there are hundreds of women whose private thoughts went with them, unrecorded or recorded and then lost, leaving behind only the careful surface of the official correspondence. But they were thinking. They were all of them thinking, in the upper rooms at night when the children were asleep and the family was occupied below, thinking about their lives and their situations and the gap between what they were and what the world permitted them to be. The composure on the surface was real. It was a genuine achievement and not a pretense. But it was surface, and beneath it there was the full complexity of an intelligent human life, being lived in difficult circumstances, assessing those circumstances, resisting them in whatever ways were available, finding satisfactions where satisfactions could be found, and carrying the rest with the patience that the position had trained into them until patience itself became a kind of wisdom. The letters they actually wrote, the ones behind the careful surface of the official correspondence, are the truest document of what the Victorian governess was. Not the 25,000 of the census, not the figures in the charity registers, not even the fictional versions that the novels provided, however sympathetic and however accurate. The actual woman, with her actual thoughts, writing to her actual sister or friend in the actual evening of an actual Tuesday, in an actual house, in the actual England of the actual 19th century. She was there. She was thinking. She was more than she was allowed to be, and she knew it, and she wrote it down when she could, and some of it survived. This is what history owes her. Not the sentimental version, not the tragic version, not the symbolic version, the actual version. The complicated, intelligent, privately resistant, outwardly composed, genuinely exhausted, occasionally angry, sometimes joyful, always specific and individual woman who sat in the upper room with her letter and her lamp and her careful copperplate hand, and said what she could say, and felt what she could not say, and carried both into the morning with as much grace as she could manage. She was there. She was real. She was more than enough. Sleep now. The story is told. The house is quiet. The window is dark and the stars are out, and somewhere in the city a clock is marking the hours in the same unhurried way that it has always marked them, indifferent to the names of those who listen, and grateful to none of them, simply counting, as time has always counted, the long patient passage of everything there is. If you enjoyed this story, what do you think the modern equivalent of the governess trap is? The role where education is required but adequately rewarded, where the work is essential but invisible. Leave your answer in the comments.